The 8th of June 1945. The Bangka Strait, a narrow, shallow channel of water between Sumatra and Bangka Island in the Dutch East Indies. A British submarine has spent the morning being hunted, not hunting, driven under by gunfire and depth charged by an alert Japanese destroyer escort that clearly suspects something is waiting in these waters. Her target, a 13,300-ton Japanese heavy cruiser carrying 1,600 troops towards Singapore, is running with the coastline pressed close on one side, leaving her almost no room to turn away from anything fired at her. The submarine's captain finally gets his shot from an awkward angle, at nearly the maximum range his torpedoes can reach, with no realistic way to reposition for anything better. He fires his entire bow salvo anyway, 8 torpedoes in one spread, and waits. In 22 minutes, one of the largest warships ever destroyed by a submarine in the whole of the Second World War will roll over and sink beneath the strait. This is the story of HMS Trenchant and the sinking of the Japanese cruiser Ashigara. By the summer of 1945, Japan's once formidable combined fleet had been reduced to a scattering of survivors, and the heavy cruiser Ashigara was very much one of them. A Myoko-class cruiser carrying 10 8-inch guns and capable of 36 knots when fully operational, Ashigara had already fought at the Battle of Surigao Strait the previous October, one of the last great gun duels in naval history, and escaped that engagement more or less intact, while other Japanese ships around her were destroyed. By June 1945, with fuel desperately short and one of her own engines out of action, she had been reduced to running troop transport duties rather than fighting as a warship, ferrying roughly 1,600 soldiers and nearly 500 tons of cargo from Batavia towards Singapore to reinforce the city's defenses as the war closed in on Japan's remaining holdings. It was, in a sense, an undignified final assignment for a cruiser that had survived some of the largest naval battles of the Pacific War, and it was precisely this transport run that put her directly in front of a waiting British submarine. Getting Trenchant into position in the first place depended on an intelligence advantage that had nothing to do with anything visible on the water. Ashigara's movements had been picked up through ultra-intercepts, decrypted Japanese signal traffic that gave Allied submarine commanders in the region advance warning of her planned route, and this intelligence had already put 2 American submarines, Blueback and Chubb, onto her trail days earlier, though neither had managed to get into a firing position before she reached safe harbor. That contact report was passed along the Allied submarine network to Commander Arthur Heslett, captain of HMS Trenchant, who was given clearance to position his boat inside the Bangka Strait specifically to intercept Ashigara on her return leg, while a second British submarine, HMS Stygian, covered the opposite side of the same stretch of water. Getting there at all meant navigating through a minefield laid earlier by the Dutch submarine 019 across the strait's northern entrance, a hazard Trenchant had to work through carefully before she could even take up her ambush position. The problem facing Heslett once he was actually in place was almost entirely tactical, and it had no clean solution. The Bangka Strait was narrow and shallow, meaning Trenchant had very limited room to maneuver for a better firing position once a target was sighted, and Ashigara was escorted by the destroyer Kamikaze, an alert escort that spent part of the morning actively hunting for exactly the kind of threat Trenchant represented. At one point, Kamikaze detected Trenchant, opened fire on her with her deck guns, and forced the British submarine to dive and take a barrage of depth charges, close enough to be alarming but not close enough to cause real damage. A torpedo Trenchant fired at the departing destroyer during this exchange missed. Rather than withdraw after being detected once already, Heslett repositioned Trenchant to a new spot in the middle of the strait and waited for Ashigara herself to come back into view, betting that the cruiser, not the destroyer, was still the priority target worth the continued risk. If you're finding this account of a submarine forced to take its shot from the worst possible angle interesting, subscribing helps the channel keep telling these stories properly. At around midday, Heslett spotted Ashigara's masts through his periscope from nearly 6 miles away, and as she closed the range, it became clear the geometry of the encounter was going to work firmly against him. The coastline hugging one side of the strait meant Ashigara had almost no room to turn away from an attack, even if she spotted it in time, but it equally meant Trenchant could not maneuver into a cleaner firing position without giving away her presence or losing the shot altogether. Hazlitt found himself limited to firing from a genuinely awkward angle. At close to the maximum effective range his torpedoes could reach, roughly 4,000 yards, a distance at which hitting a moving warship with any individual torpedo was far from guaranteed. Rather than wait for a better opportunity that might never come, Hazlitt committed his entire bow tube capacity to the shot, firing a full spread of 8 torpedoes in one salvo, using the width of the pattern itself to compensate for the imprecision of the range and angle. Ashigara's own escort of open water was gone the moment the salvo left Trenchant's tube. With the shoreline pinning her in on one flank, Ashigara's only real option was to accelerate and turn directly into the spread rather than away from it. In the hope of threading through the gaps between individual torpedo tracks, she managed to evade 3 of the 8 fired at her. The other 5 found their mark. The impacts tore a series of holes along her starboard side, one blast severe enough to eventually blow away a section of her bow entirely, and fires spread rapidly through the ship, throwing up a pall of smoke thick enough to obscure Hazlitt's view through the periscope even as his own crew queued up, boat by boat, to take turns watching the damage they had caused. Ashigara took on a heavy list to starboard almost immediately and began to capsize within minutes. By 12:37, roughly 22 minutes after the torpedo struck, she rolled over and went down in the strait. The human cost aboard Ashigara was severe, reflecting just how many men had been packed aboard a warship being used as an improvised troop transport. Estimates of the dead run as high as 1,000, 200 to 1,350, the overwhelming majority of them soldiers rather than crew, caught below decks or in the water with nowhere to go in a narrow, current-swept strait. The destroyer Kamikaze, which had spent the morning trying and failing to protect her, turned back to the wreck site and managed to rescue roughly 400 troops and 853 of Ashigara's crew, including her captain and the rear admiral aboard, both of whom survived the sinking. Trenchant, having fired her full salvo from a position she could not meaningfully defend if the attack had gone wrong, suffered no damage and no casualties, slipping away from the strait once the attack was complete. Ashigara's sinking stands as one of the largest warships destroyed by a submarine attack during the entire Second World War. A genuinely rare achievement, given how difficult it generally was for a submerged submarine to close on and successfully torpedo a fast-moving heavy cruiser under active escort, particularly this late in the war when Japanese destroyer crews were experienced and wary of exactly this kind of ambush. The action also stood as a small but telling example of how thoroughly Allied intelligence had come to dominate the later stages of the Pacific War. A single piece of decrypted signal traffic had been enough to put not 1 but 3 separate Allied submarines onto a single cruiser's route days in advance, ensuring that even if the first 2 failed to get a shot, a third would eventually be waiting exactly where she needed to be. By June 1945, with Japan's surviving major warships reduced largely to transport and escort duties, actions like this one were quietly finishing off what remained of a fleet that, only a few years earlier, had contested the entire Pacific Ocean. Nothing about Trenchant's position that afternoon suggested she was about to sink one of the largest ships any submarine would destroy in the whole war. She had already been detected once, driven under by gunfire and depth charges, and forced to take her eventual shot from an angle and a range that offered no real margin for error against a target with almost no room to maneuver, but also almost no reason to expect a submarine there at all. Hazlitt's answer to a genuinely bad firing position was not to wait for a better one that the coastline and the escort destroyer were never going to allow him. It was to commit everything he had in one spread and trust the numbers to do what precision alone could not. 5 of 8 torpedoes found their target. 22 minutes later, one of the last surviving heavy cruisers of the Imperial Japanese Navy was gone.